So far in our drag drop journey, we've covered this drag enter when an element enters our drop zone. We then covered dragging leave, where we're still maintaining a drag and then leave the drop zone. We also have a drag over, which when we're still dragging and in the drop zone, and we also have a drop when we let go of a draggable item. However, at the moment, we do not have any events bound to this draggable object itself. We've added our draggable equals true attribute. However, we have this drag me class, which is not getting used. So what we're going to do is set up a quick constant called drag me, and we're going to say document query selector and then ask for that element. Now, when we start to drag this element, we're then going to bind an event. And that's exactly what we're going to look at in this video, is the drag start event. So this applies to any element that we want to, in fact, potentially bind some information to as we start dragging it. Now for this, we're going to console log the event and then look at this data transfer property, which I've mentioned before, so I promised you that we'll have a look through it. Now, as I start to drag, you can see that this drag start then happens once. We can drag again, and you can see it's fired again. So if we expand our data transfer, you can see that we can customize the drop effect. So if we wanted a particular drop effect for this element, we could actually bind it inside of here. It doesn't need to be on the drop zone directly. We could have different elements which give you different drop effects. So this is quite nice. And this is why I like logging out the APIs and diving through them and asking particular questions to myself and then exploring those a little bit further. You can see that we also have this files. So this is something that we're going to be looking at as well as we progress through building this drag and drop. We're also going to build the capability to look at these files, and you can see this file list API. And this is one of my favorite aspects of this HTML5 API. However, the piece that I'm most interested in isn't this items, it's not the types, it's our prototype. You can see inside of here, there's a few more things. We have drop effect, effect allowed, files again, which is a nice getter, items, another getter, but we also have this get data and set data. We also want, if you want to set a custom drag image, you can also do that as well. We're not going to cover that in this course, but of course, go away and do this in your own time. Now, as we know, the event.target gives us, for example, if we say event.target, and then start to drag that item, it gives us the element that we've actually asked for. It gives us the target element. So what I'm going to do, let's assume that we've got some kind of reordering application. We're going to have an ID. Let's say that this has some particular data bound to it, and we're going to call it item-0. So if we save this out and then drag it again, you can see that we have an ID. So inside our event.target, we could use getAttribute. However, because it's an ID, we have this .id property. We can then drag it and we see this item-0. So with this in mind, I want to take this event target and then set the data to our data transfer object. Now, if you're wondering what this data transfer object actually does, we'll see this spring into life in a moment. So the way that we can set this data, and this is essentially going to allow us to pass some data from the particular element and pick it up inside of our drop event, which is really nice. And it might be that we have some to-do app, for example, as a simple example, where we can click and reorder the item. So we only want to reorder the item after we've actually dropped it, which is exactly why I've given it some kind of numeric style ID. Now, our set data API, if we bring this back up, we have the format, which is a string, and the data, which is also a string. Now, the format simply accepts a type. And this, for example, will be text/plain. You could use text/HTML, and you could also create your own types, such as text/ultimate, for example. Now, because we need to set the data, which is of the type string, what I'm going to do is just paste in our event.target.id. So let's save this out. This is then going to, as soon as we start dragging that item, it's going to, behind the scenes, that's now set that event target ID to the element that was dropped. So now what we can do inside of our drop, instead of just console logging drop, we can console log our event.dataTransfer, and instead of setting the data, we can get the data. Now here we have to also specify the exact same type. So we have to specify text/plain. So I click and I drag, that's now called our setter. If I hover over and then let go, you can see that our line 64, which as you can see in my text editor, is our get data call. So we've actually passed some data of what element we are dragging down to our drop event. So at this point, we might have an array of objects and we're going to reorder them based on the order that you've selected. And this is just one example of how to pass the data. Now, because this is an ID, what I'm going to do is say const element equals document get element. We could use a query selector, but because it's an ID, I'm just going to pass in the get element by ID. Just to make things a little bit neater, I'm going to say const ID equals event.datatransfer.getData. So we'll break these out into a few variables, pass our ID in. Now we can say dropZone.append. And all I want to do is append our element. So you may be wondering what I'm actually doing here. Let's demonstrate this. So I'll take this, drop it in, and you can see that we've now moved our element. So this is just one idea that we could have. By passing the particular ID of the node which has been moved, we can then go and fetch it again, for example, and then drop it somewhere else. And already I think you can start to envisage a few different examples that you might have by implementing your own features in future web applications. So that's how to pass DOM node data. We could pass any other kinds of data. We could use a data attribute perhaps to bind some specific data to a DOM node. It might have a particular key that then points to something else in a data structure, and then you could pass that information through as well. But in this video, we have looked at this data transfer object. We've then used our set data passed in our ID. Now I mentioned as well that we have this text/plain, and we could customize it to absolutely anything we want. So I'm going to change this to text/ultimate, and it doesn't really change the behavior. But the recommendation is to keep things nice and simple based on what you're actually setting, which in our case is just a string value. So we'll keep it as text/plain. So that's it for this lesson. We've broken out our ID, which gives us that through the data transfer object. And of course, if we had 5 different draggable items, every time we drag, we would then get a new ID passed to us, and each individual item would then be dropped in. You can see here it's trying to drag in all these different items. However, they're coming up null because we don't have an ID bound to the particular item. So that's it for this lesson. Now in the next lesson, instead of our set data, we're actually going to get rid of this. And then we're going to look at how to drag and handle a particular file when we drag and drop a file, because this is a really nice feature for us to learn how to build ourselves from scratch, a nice drag and drop functionality. So that's it for the lesson. Let's wrap it up and start dragging some files into our drop zone.